Welcome to Beyond Boba, a podcast brought to you by APIDA's interns, where we come together to have casual conversations with the aim of dispelling myths relating to the APIDA community. So this includes Asian Pacific Islander, Desi, Americans. In this week's episode 4, we are going to talk about the 4 big M's that is pretty significant to the Asian community, which is the Monolithic Model Minority Myth. Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine.
And I'm Cade. And today, before we begin and break deep into conversation about the Monolithic Model Minority Myth, we just wanted to acknowledge the enormous diversity in the Asian American community, which contributes to how both me and Katherine experience the monolithic myth and the model minority myth along with their interactions, right? So just as a background, I personally grew up as a third generation mixed race Filipino Japanese American, whereas Katherine grew up in Vietnam prior to moving to the States, which means that we undoubtedly are affected differently by these two myths. And we both are also affected by it differently than many of our viewers listening. So it's conversations like these that allow us to get a better sense of ourselves, better understanding of others in the APIDA community, and just start to become better advocates for each other as a whole. So
Yeah, so, let's just get straight to the topic of today. So the first thing we would love to talk about is monolithic myth. So Kate, in your personal views, what is that exactly?
So the monolithic myth, as a whole, is very interconnected with the model minority myth, as we'll talk about later. But generally speaking, the monolithic myth is this idea that all Asians as a whole are representative of East Asia. A lot of people within, or both within and outside of the community, don't realize the diversity within the APA community, right? So people on the outside often think, oh, Asian. I think of Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, and this also leads to a lot of misidentity, I guess. Generally, I will not even start to explain how many times people ask me if I was Korean or just generally not even gonna lie. The other day, shout out to one of my friends, but I told him that I was Filipino and he asked me if I liked mango sticky rice, which is just not Filipino, it's Thai. But this just gives an example, right? Because you're in the Asian community, but you don't realize that not all Asians are the same, I guess. But yeah, have you had any similar experiences, or what is your take on the monolithic myth?
Yeah, I totally hear you on that. One of the first image people think of is East Asian, and even in media, films and all that, whenever they talk about Asian representation, they always try to bring in someone who is East Asian looking, but like you mentioned, there's so many more, diversity within the Asian community itself. Myself, I'm Southeast Asian, I'm Vietnamese. And, in Southeast Asia, there's so many different cultures and, we kind of often being forgotten and kind of just clumped in as a group. But recently, I do notice there's more representation in films, the recent Disney Princess, there's the first Southeast Asian film represented. So I'm very excited to see that being more recognized. But yeah, as a Vietnamese, a lot of our culture really overlap a lot with Chinese culture, and a lot of times people just see us as oh yeah, you're kind of Chinese, which is really hurtful at times, because our cultural heritage and values are a little different. So yeah, I hope with more representation will help people realize that in the future. There's more than that.
Yeah.
And there's also South Asian population too. And there's so many that is often forgotten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with that point. When I was growing up, it was kind of weird just because I'm mixed race. So I would see all of this Japanese representation in different movies like Picture Bride and things like that. But I could never really see any Filipino representation, in my opinion. until much more recently, but even still, like
Yeah.
now it isn't. And I think it's sad to say that we still see this today, just in media in general. Like you will have Korean people playing Chinese people just because they're
Mm-hmm.
light skinned Asians. When honestly, like there are so many talented people who belong to the race that these actors are playing in. But just because
Exactly.
everybody on the outside thinks like, oh, Asians are Asians, right? You're gonna cast somebody who's like has no cultural connection to represent a character who's supposed to be so connected, right, to
Mm-hmm.
whatever race that are or ethnicity that they're playing. Um, but yeah, and I think that like as you said, we're slowly getting there. A lot of people are excited, like they're like we're finally being represented in media, and I'm like, okay, we are, but like we
There's
shouldn't
still a
just be
lot to.
satisfied with
Mm-hmm.
this. Yeah, there's so much more. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, so moving on, like I know I talked about this a little earlier about the monolithic myth combining with the model minority myth in its in its effects and things like that. But can you tell me like what do you know about the model minority myth? I know that it's probably a newer concept, especially because like even for me it was a newer concept going into USC. But can you tell me more about like what you've heard and what you know about the model minority myth?
Yeah. So just, straight up like model minority myth was kind of like the term was first coined back in like 1966, and I think it was like in a New York Times article or something that was just talking about, how Japanese Americans were able to like within just 20 years become successful, even though they had like the whole internment camp situation, and like as a minority they were able to become successful. And I think like that term was created kind of like to um, kind of like used to pit us like Asian Americans against like other minorities of people of color. Just kind of like saying like, Asians are able to be successful and all that, they're hardworking and all that. So that means like all other races should be able to achieve the same. And like in general, like the stereotype that this model minority myth is like painting is kind of like saying that Asian Americans are high achieving in academics, we're well off economically, we're like middle class, I believe, and also like we're kind of like free from like a lot of like racial tensions, and that really paints like a really negative false narrative of like all Asian Americans, because like within the Asian community, like you mentioned earlier, there's so many different racial group like ethnicities. So it's not right to like just generalize it to like all Asians in general. And yeah, like I remember seeing somewhere that like within, and I think you yeah, in the Daniel Day Kim's like interview, I believe Kate, you were talking about this earlier, and I don't know if you want to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so like I remember I don't know if many were like if you watched it, but I was really moved. Daniel Day Kim testified in front of Congress, I think a month or so ago, and he said like a lot of people don't realize that Asian Americans as a race, we have the greatest disparity in income levels. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so which kind of accounts for why a lot of people say like, oh, Asians are so rich, like as a generalization, or Asians are well off. They don't need these extra opportunities in diversity programs. They don't need these things. And people forget how unique different experiences in different walks of life in the Asian community are, right? So like there's a median, um, and what I've seen is that like only certain races make that median or higher, and these groups
Mm-hmm.
pull the average up, right? So I think the
Right.
median was like somewhere around 70K around there.
Mm-hmm.
And certain groups like um Hmong people, Burmese people, they tend not to even make like half of that. Uh which is really detrimental because like people say Asians don't need the opportunity. They're making this much money. Well, not all of them. They don't all make that much money. Um they don't all have that same standard of education. They don't all have that opportunity. And a lot of this is just attributed to the monolithic myth, because everybody says, you know, all Asians are the same, all Asians do this, but they really don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes together with the model minority myth, because it's like when all Asians are brought together and represented only by East Asians, they're also held to such a high standard that most, or not even most, some Asians just don't have the ability to get to, just because like they were never given the same opportunities. They were never raised in the same communities. I think that we tend to forget that each group of Asians had a different story of why they came to America, had a different upbringing. Um, and that doesn't mean that one is better than the other. That doesn't mean that because one is hardworking that they're able to attain all of this success. It's because some just people just are born with more opportunities than others based by like where they live and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
and
yeah,
like kind of like going back on history a little bit, but I think like one of the big reasons that contributed to that was like I believe there was like a immigration law back then that kind of like preferred to like, you know, offer immigration to people with like really high educational backgrounds. So like a lot of like there was a time period when a lot of like Asian immigrants were like doctors and engineers. So like they came with like, you know, certain kind of like backgrounds already. So that kind of like, you know, really contributed to like the general idea that like the I was like say like, you know, white American kind of like wanted to paint the picture that Asians are well off on their own by being hardworking. And and yeah, like that, you know, not only hurts our Asian community, but it also hurts like other minorities, especially the Black community, and kind of like just pit like the minorities against each other, which is really hurtful to all of us. And like especially for our within our community, like growing up, I'm sure like not all of us know, like you mentioned earlier, not all of us know of the model minority term, but like we kind of grow up with like a certain standards to live up to. And I'm not sure like Kate, like when you were growing up, if you had experienced something similar. But for me, even though I grew up abroad, I was still held to like the standards of like, you know, having to be high achieving straight A student, and you know, like like be the best, like do like tons of extracurriculars just to like, you know, use my achievement as like a standard of like how well I am as a person. Yeah, like did you have that growing up in Hawaii too?
I wouldn't say that particular end of the model minority myth. Um, but another part that is definitely very prevalent is the idea of being passive. I think that I was really
Mm.
raised with that kind of thing, where it was like, you know, like if I was having a hard time with something, or like somebody said something that was off color, like I was raised to just say, you know what, I'm gonna just shut up. I don't want to
Mm.
cause a commotion. Uh, I feel like I was raised to be more of a pacifist. Just because the idea was like, okay, like, um, my ancestors maybe had it worse wherever they were from, so you should just shut up and deal with it. Um, and I think that brings us to like where there's a huge generational gap. I think, especially in activism today, um, because like I think this was especially prevalent in Black Lives Matter, and even today, where it's like Asian Americans who are older say, you know, we came to this country. This is the American dream. You know, there's problems. It's not as bad as, you know, wherever we came from. So we should be grateful. And I feel like for us, or at least for me, like for our generation, it's like, this is our country. We shouldn't just accept the way it is. We shouldn't just deal with it, because we know it can be better and we want it to be better. And I think that that's why there's like I said, there's been a lot of, I guess, gaps in understanding between generations, because people who are older say like, why stand up for Black Lives Matter? Why do this? It doesn't affect you.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't affect you. Until recently, right, with the anti-Asian hate, like I feel like even with that, some people are like, well, it's not affecting you directly, so why should you care? Like just shut up and move along. Like don't stir up commotion.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that that's definitely something that's been more prevalent these days.
Yeah, I totally agree with like, with the recent incidents. Like even like my uncle who I'm currently staying with, like he just told me like, just stay in, like don't go out, just, protect yourself like that. And like instead of like using that narrative, I could have like, voiced like, against like why are we like being defensive rather than like, trying to advocate for ourselves and supporting others who are not as like doesn't have the same platform to yeah. And I feel like the passive voice you were mentioning, um like I mean I my parents didn't migrate here, so I'm not sure, like I don't think my family story will be as closely aligned to yours, but like for me, like as a foreigner in the country, like I should keep my head down, like just stay in my lane and like be a diligent, person. And I think that I don't know, like
Yeah, no. I get what you're saying. Like the idea is just um, like just do what you're told. Don't do anything else. Period. Um, and I thought this was so interesting because honestly, I thought that this was how it was only recently. But I actually did a project on Japanese taiko drumming, and it turns out like this has been a long-standing generational gap. Um, Especially because like for me, like with Japanese heritage, I found out that a lot of people after the internment camps just completely wanted to do away with their culture, right? They they realized that any form of Japanese culture may make them feel like that they were or may have people perceive them as a foreigner. And which is why after the internment camps, a lot of Japanese culture was lost. Because the whole idea was like, just don't do any of it. Nobody will bother you. And gratefully, some people decided, no, we're going to stand up for it. We're going to continue to build like, you know, Japantown. We're going to continue the culture of taiko and things like that. But the bottom line is that this idea of just sticking your head down has always been um, a big deal with Asian Americans in America. And which I think brings me to question whether this will always be the case or when we get older, things will hopefully change, right? Where we're proud to be a part of our culture. We don't need to say, like, let's be passive, let's let it happen. Because, like, I see it right now that our generation is sticking up more, but who
mhm.
knows if, you know, we'll revert to that as we get older. And I think that that's kind of scary thinking about it. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, aside from that, like depressing stuff, um, do you think that like in your experience, either of these myths has affected you like in the education system or like professionally or anything other than maybe like personally?
Yeah, no, I feel like I do experience a lot of like the model minority stuff relating to like my academic side and also like job recruiting aspect. Like right now I'm trying to apply for internships, and I noticed that there's a lot of like diverse leadership diversity programs at big firms for other minorities, but I don't seem to find any that is offering to like Asian students. And I at times I question why that is. Like I like we are a minority. I think like in the U.S. there's only 6% of the population is Asian. So obviously by definition we're a minority. And I do recognize that yeah, like on average, Asians are deemed to be more well off. Like there's more resources and like all that. But like we just talked about all of the things we just mentioned earlier, that is not really true. So like obviously students who are from like Cambodia with the Cambodian ethnic, or like, you know, not like the higher, like the general high high income family households will not benefit as much with like not having those leadership opportunities to work at companies. So yeah, like on like a professional level, I'm not getting those. I'm not seeing as many opportunities being offered. And yeah, like on a academic sense, like for me personally, I'm not having too much trouble with that. But I know like a lot of my friends, like, you know, their parents really force them to be in like high achieving, and that hurts them mentally as well. Like a lot of stress, and like they're really hard on themselves. Like, you know, like there's a term I recently heard, like A is for average, B is for bad for like Asian families and
Yeah.
students. And I think that's, for me, that's like low-key pretty true. Like with my own like perception, but that is really hurting a lot of my friends as well. And like I noticed, like even for me and my friends, we kind of like base our value on how well we're doing academically, which is, that's not what we should be doing, because we're more than just academics. We have personal interests,
Mhm.
you know, personal goals in life, and yeah, that shouldn't be the case. But yeah.
No, yeah, I definitely agree. Like, I feel like people on the outside often say, like, you know, why complain about having such a quote unquote good like stereotype? But I think as we've
Mm,
seen and as we will
yeah.
continue to see, like both the monolithic myth and the model minority myth, which follows it, they both really hurt both like minorities outside of the Asian community, but also within the Asian community. Like
Mm-hmm.
I think we're talking about it, but it creates a minority within a minority. And what I mean by that is like
Right.
Asians are a minority and we're starting to get this representation. We're starting to like be seen as equals. But within our minority, we're still leaving behind those who are underrepresented, those who are
Mm-hmm.
um, don't have as many resources. And I think that that's where that needs to change. I think that a lot of people within the Asian community need to start having these conversations with other people who don't have the same background as them, and starting to understand like the true diversity, right? I feel like a lot of us have certain connections to Asian culture that, you know, of course unite us, but that doesn't mean that we should just disregard or repress any of the differences. Um, so I think that just starts with educating ourselves about the
Mm-hmm.
different walks, you know, the fact that not everybody is like East Asian, not everybody has the same backgrounds, and that outside of that, we also just need to be an ally to other minorities generally, right? I think that we can't let some stupid term from 1960s coined during the civil rights movement pit ourselves
Mm-hmm.
against other minorities. I think that we're at a time where we can, you know, unite with other people and just stand together as minorities, just trying to be together and fight for just being treated as people, right? Um, but I think that you know that brings us to the end of our discussion, unfortunately. But I think that there's still a lot for both of us to learn and a lot for our viewers to learn and think about, um, you know, in the coming weeks, and just get out there and learn more about the diversity and be an ally. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Great way to wrap it up, Kate. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our listeners for, you know, catching on with this episode of Beyond Boba. And for this podcast, we are giving away a super sleek looking reusable boba cup with a stainless steel boba straw. So if you are a USC student, please go to bit.ly/beyondboba4 for a chance to win this amazing cup. And that giveaway will close in 1 week after the release of this episode. And yeah, beyond, just, you know, keep keep looking out for the next week's episode. That is actually our last episode of Beyond Boba, and we'll be talking about high expectations members of the APIDA community are facing. And as always, let us know what you think about our podcast by emailing beyondbobapodcast@gmail.com, and share with your friends. And we hope to see you next week. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.